Alhaitham is finally out, and this is an honest look at how he works with different teams and weapons at Constellation Zero. So here's exactly what you need to know about him in this showcase video. So in this video, I made sure to prepare the most important questions I wanted to be answered about Alhaitham, and I think you'll be surprised about the results. So I'll be showcasing Alhaitham's personal damage, what builds and teams I tested, which weapons I found to be amazing for him, and I'll tell you what's great and not so great about him. First of all, let's talk about his personal damage. For this showcase, I'll be using the recently released event weapon, which I'm just calling it the Demon Umbrella, but if you don't have it, a perfectly good free-to-play option would be Iron Sting. For the artifacts, he is using 4-piece Gilded Dreams, and his talents are all raised to level 9, and of course, he is Constellation Zero. Now, starting off with his normal attacks. As expected, they barely deal anything, but since he can also gain Dendro Infusion, then the damage starts to range from 2,600 to 4,500. Now, he can pull off a decent 12k hit from his skill, and when he uses his burst, it deals roughly 9,400 damage up to 10 times, depending on how many mirrors he has. Speaking of which, each mirror deals 6,887 damage, and honestly, with all things considered, his raw damage without any buffs looks pretty good. However, in an actual team, if somebody provides Dendro Resistance Shred from Deepwood Memories, and he starts dealing spread damage by reacting with Electro, assisted by his Gilded Dream set, then the numbers start to look really good. Now, I've tested his damage in two ways. The first one was quickswap, basically unloading his skill in burst and then swapping out. By doing this, he was able to dish out roughly 340,000 damage, and causing 8 spread reactions in only 5 seconds. That's pretty amazing, especially considering he can be swapped out when his burst is still unleashing damage. Now, the majority of this overall damage comes from his burst, because before unleashing it, I use his skill and then charge attack to gain 3 Chiselite mirrors, which then get consumed when the burst is used, and 10 hits are dealt to the enemy. And just to be crystal clear about the mirrors, as long as Alhaitham has 1 Chiselite mirror, his normal, charge, and plunge attacks will have Dendro Infusion. He can gain 2 mirrors when he uses the skill, but if he already had any mirrors previously, then he would only gain 1. He can also gain 1 mirror thanks to his passive, which is generated after he uses charge or plunge attack, but only every 12 seconds. To put it simply, for quickswap I just showcased, I use his skill then charge attack, which puts him at exactly 3 mirrors, the max amount he can have. The most important thing about these mirrors is that they can unleash projection attacks every 1.6 seconds after Alhaitham uses his Dendro Infused attacks. You can clearly see the attacks by their distinct animations. If you have 3 mirrors, 3 hits will land, 2 mirrors, 2 hits, and 1 mirror, well, 1 hit. Now, every 4 seconds, 1 mirror will disappear, meaning the projection attacks become weaker and deal less hits. And so, in 12 seconds, Alhaitham will lose all of them. Finally, if you use his burst with mirrors, all of them will get consumed, and the burst will deal more hits. The trick here is that if you start the burst without any mirrors, then all 3 of them get generated for free, but the burst deals only 4 hits. Which brings me to the next way I tested his overall damage, and that's by playing him as an on-field damage dealer. If I start the combo by using his burst without mirrors, he will gain all 3 of them, and then I can use his skill to regain 1 mirror back after waiting for those 4 seconds before he drops down to 2 mirrors. And then if I wait 4 more seconds, I can do a charge attack to regain an additional 1. This basically allows him to maintain all 3 mirrors for about 18 seconds or so, after which only 2 mirrors remain, and 4 seconds later 1 mirror, before it disappears altogether. And so by following this combo I just described, Alhaitham is able to achieve about 700,000 damage with a total of 23 spreads in over 17 seconds. What's really interesting about this test was that I quickly noticed the majority of his on-field damage comes from the Chiselite mirrors. You see, the thing about his mirrors dealing damage is that if you have all 3 of them, almost always 2 out of 3 hits become spread damage, and in this case, each hit deals about 28,000 damage. Or if you take into account all 3 hits, that's about 67k damage, which is pretty awesome if you ask me, and I had a lot of fun buffing him up and unleashing some really powerful projection attacks. And what's even more interesting, more than 53% of Alhaitham's on-field damage is made up of mirrors unleashing those projection attacks. Just keep in mind this damage was calculated when all 3 mirrors are maintained, which is extremely important to understand when it comes to dealing the most efficient damage with him. But now you might be wondering, which one is better, quickswap or on-field Alhaitham? Well, to find out, let's talk about it in this next part. Just like with every other showcase in my videos, keep an eye on the bottom of the screen to see what loadout and stats I'm using for Alhaitham. Now, without wasting your time, I'm just gonna tell you the truth. If you care about the Abyss or some challenging events, then on-field Alhaitham is the way to go. In world exploration, most of the time it's gonna be Alhaitham unleashing skill and infusion attacks, and the target will be dead by then. So, what's the biggest problem with quickswap Alhaitham in the Abyss? To put it simply, it's the high energy cost. Sure, it looks great when he can unleash a lot of damage in a short amount of time, time, but after the burst is over, the long cooldown on his skill and the fact he has no mirrors remaining leaves him with an only option to deal normal white damage. This further becomes problematic because of the way his energy generation works. He generates one particle when the mirrors unleash the projection attack, which means these particles are sustained. They are not generated when the skill hits, and he needs to remain on field to absorb those particles efficiently. For example, I built this team with Nahida, Hyperbloom Raiden, and Kokomi holding Thrilling Tales. All of them provide some kind of a boost to Alhaitham's quickswap damage, so he can unleash those big numbers. But because it's hard to regain energy, next time I rotate back to him, he doesn't have enough energy, and all I can do now is just use his skill and charge attack to maintain those mirrors until they disappear, and hopefully he can have the burst ready on the next rotation. This puts him in a really weird playstyle, and half of the potential is lost when he cannot unleash the burst. I mean, maybe there's a really good team that allows him to be a quick swap character, so he can unleash a ton of damage in the span of 5 seconds, but for the rest of this showcase, I will talk about his on-field playstyle. So the first archetype I explored was Hyperbloom, more specifically Double Dendro Hyperbloom. This entirely free-to-play team comp is made up of Traveler, Cookie, and Xingqiu. I really like this team a lot. It has everything the current meta offers, and by using his free-to-play weapon, whether it's the Demon Umbrella or fully refined Iron Sting, both perform really well. And since Alhaitham acts as a driver, he can utilize Traveler's EM boost from the burst, as well as gain 12% Dendro damage increase thanks to C6. But the biggest thing about this team is the Double Dendro itself. Previously, not many comps were built like this, but with Alhaitham, they work really well and open up to a new kind of way you can experience the game. For example, Double Dendro with Nahida lets Alhaitham enjoy her massive EM boost, and since she's also equipped with Deepwood Memories, both Alhaitham and her can enjoy the Dendro resistance shred on enemies for a really long duration, since it keeps getting refreshed by her Tri-Karma hits when she's off-field. There's also YaoYao, who acts as a great Deepwood user, and she can also heal, making it very comfy to run these Hyperbloom teams. I especially like the fact her bunny she summons from the skill will generate 5 particles over 10-second period, so if you use her skill and then switch to Alhaitham, he can significantly reduce his energy needs, and I could run him as low as 120% ER when YaoYao is in the team. I'll talk about YaoYao more in my next video that's coming out a few hours later after this video. Now, things get a little dicey when he's the only Dendro unit in the team. Somebody has to hold Deepwood Memories in Hyperbloom and Burgeon teams, and that becomes Alhaitham's responsibility. For example, the highly popular Double Hydro with EM Raiden team works really well with Alhaitham, but he acts more as a glorified Dendro driver here. He has to sacrifice his damage potential by getting at least 150 to 170% ER, and then he also needs to use Deepwood Artifact set, which otherwise other units could hold and let him have fun with something like Gilded Dreams. I mean, don't get me wrong, he can still deal really good damage as a driver, but it could be so much higher. However, things get a lot more questionable when using him in Burgeon. Basically, I had to slap Favonius weapons on Fischl, Xingqiu, and Alhaitham, just so Thoma's burst could activate off cooldown, because that's what everybody's relying on. And since Alhaitham now uses Favonius sword and Deepwood instead of his damage focused loadout, he really just acts as a worse driver than Nahida for this Burgeon team. Finally, the last Bloom team I wanted to check out was Nilus. I think it works pretty well if running Double Hydro, Double Dendro. Somebody else can hold the Deepwood set and Alhaitham can fully focus on damage. However, you really need to think about healing if you want Alhaitham to survive as an on-field driver. Now, you also might be wondering, what about Quicken teams? Well, they're pretty good, especially if you run Double Dendro Quicken teams, but I just feel like you get a lot more value and damage when the team also utilizes Bloom reactions. Because running just strictly Quicken was already something that could be done previously, and Alhaitham doesn't add anything new to those teams. Although I will say that this comp of Fischl, Nahida, and Zhongli is pretty fun, especially if he's using Harbinger of Dawn. So, what do I think about this scribe? Well, while he does share an extremely similar kit to Keqing, he plays completely different compared to her. I like the fact that the majority of his damage comes from the mirror projection attacks when you use him on field, and I like the idea of managing the mirrors. The problem I have right now is that I can barely see those tiny mirrors on him in the middle of combat, so usually I have to count down 4 seconds before I can use his skill or charge attack to regain 1 mirror, because it is important that he maintains all 3 mirrors for as long as possible, since they can trigger 2 spreads most of the time, and a lot of damage comes from that. It is a bit sad his energy costs 70, and his particle generation is sustained from the projection attacks, so this leaves him with very little quick swap teams I could think of, because I do like the fact he can unleash a ton of damage in 5 seconds, but the next rotation, he just won't have the energy to do it again, unless I hyper invest into ER, add some Dendro allies with maybe some Favonius weapons, which just makes no sense at this point. Also, if we talk about his loadouts, if he is the only Dendro unit in Bloom teams, Abyss, then he will need to use Deepwood Set, otherwise he is left with Gilded Dreams, or a mixture of Gilded, Emblem, and Wanderers. You could go for a 4-set Emblem if utilizing his quickswap build, but it will come with the limitations I previously mentioned. On the bright side, he has a good selection of free-to-play weapons. Iron Sting and Demon Umbrella work great, but if you use a shielder, then slapping on him Harbinger of Dawn is also extremely good budget option. Most importantly, make sure to consider building some energy recharge, because running him solo will very likely require you to use ER Sands or weapon to have an off cooldown uptime for his burst, which he desperately needs if he wants to maintain his on-field presence. But I believe the most important takeaway about him would be that you can build a lot of interesting and different double Dendro teams utilizing Bloom and Quicken reactions. He works really well with Nahida, Traveler, and YaoYao, especially Nahida when going up against single target bosses. However, if you're not interested in building these kinds of teams and you already have Nahida, or you're saving up for her rerun, then I wouldn't recommend pulling for Alhaitham. Still, he's a really solid Dendro unit with a fun playstyle, and you can easily use him as an on-field damage dealer or driver for Bloom teams to clear the Abyss with no problems. And in world exploration, well, just like any character, he melts the enemies in sight, and his teleportation skill comes in handy when exploring. So all in all, he is a great but not a necessary unit to have if you're just entering endgame content and want to focus on the Abyss. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd appreciate if you could press the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.